As the news of Jim Jones potentially facing life in jails spreads like wildfire, the hip-hop community is currently in full astonishment. Yes, just when it seems that his legal issues could not get much worse, the FBI has discovered fresh, incriminating evidence that may permanently end his life. The full breadth of Jim Jones' alleged involvement in criminal operations is finally coming to light, leaving fans stunned, insiders frantically, and the music industry preparing for the fallout. Reports are coming in, and some say this is just a witch hunt, but others say the evidence is so strong that even Jim's closest supporters can no longer stand up for him. What precisely did the FBI discover, though? Is the career and freedom of the Dipset icon truly at an end? Or is there a surprise that nobody anticipated? There is an uncontrollable amount of speculation, and the streets are humming. How did it actually happen? Who else is involved? The most crucial question is, will Jim Jones lose everything soon? Hold on tight as we delve into the most significant hip-hop scandal of the year. When it was shockingly revealed that Jim Jones had been caught in a large-scale FBI sting, the hip-hop community was rocked. However, this arrest was not your typical one. No, this was big. Jim Jones wasn't just dealing with a small charge or a legal misunderstanding. He was facing serious charges this time. So serious that legal experts were already suggesting that he would face life in prison. Early dawn raids were the beginning of it all. At least 3 places associated with Jim Jones were stormed by federal authorities, including a residence where he was allegedly staying, according to multiple sources. Blacked-out SUVs, heavily armed officers, and the obvious anxiety that follows a high-profile arrest by the federal government were all features of the dramatic scene that witnesses recounted. Living close to the place where Jim was arrested, one witness claimed that they were awakened by the sound of a loud knock on a door. They were shouting, the witness disclosed. Someone inside was being urged to come out while raising their hands. It was fierce. Jim Jones was led out in handcuffs in a matter of minutes, appearing stunned but calm. The true question, however, was why? How could Jim Jones' actions justify such a risky arrest? Rumors first circulated. Some said it was a miscommunication, while others conjectured it had to do with past instances finally coming back to haunt him. However, when the first significant leaks began to come to light, the reality became much more bizarre than anyone had anticipated. Insiders claim that this bust wasn't a random one. For years, the FBI had been keeping an eye on Jim Jones. By using wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover agents to get evidence, they allegedly constructed a strong case. And at last they had taken action. However, what were the charges? At that point, the situation became even more startling. According to several FBI sources, Jim Jones was allegedly involved in a vast criminal enterprise that went much beyond music. He was suspected of being involved in money laundering, narcotics trafficking, and illicit financial operations, according to the authorities. It didn't end there, though. The FBI claims that Jim Jones was a major role and not merely associated with criminal conduct. Allegedly, they possessed money records, recordings, and even informants who had given thorough explanations of his involvement. The biggest shock of all was that someone close to Jim had flipped. You're correct. Jim's longtime buddy and business partner was allegedly arrested months prior on separate crimes. Allegedly, this individual had struck a deal with federal prosecutors, facing severe jail time. In exchange, they had relinquished all of their knowledge concerning Jim Jones. They allegedly supplied so damaging evidence that it validated the Fed's presumptions, and they acted without hesitation after gathering the necessary evidence. At that point, the raid took place. The operation was meticulously prepared to make sure Jim Jones had no escape route, according to law enforcement sources. The feds moved quickly, striking many sites at once to gather evidence and keep any important papers or materials from being destroyed. Not just Jim Jones was taken in, though. He was arrested along with several other people, according to reports that surfaced shortly after, raising the possibility that this was not a single case, but rather a component of a much bigger federal investigation, which instantly prompted the horrifying query: who else was involved? It was impossible for the government to stop at Jim alone if they had spent years constructing this case. People began to question if there were any connections to other rappers. Were more people going to be arrested? And maybe most importantly, would Jim Jones speak, or would he remain silent? For when someone faces life in prison, the pressure to reach an agreement becomes unbearable. And that's when things became even more sinister. Jim Jones is facing serious charges, according to legal experts. When they pursue someone, federal prosecutors give it their all because they dislike losing cases, and what they had was incriminating in this instance. According to insiders, the proof included surveillance tape purportedly demonstrating Jim Jones's meetings with important players in an underground organization, wiretaps that record discussions on money transfers and other matters, records of his finances that connect him to offshore accounts and questionable transactions. Now, things could grow worse because Jim's background could work against him. Although he had avoided significant legal issues in recent years, he could yet face legal repercussions for some of his prior affiliations. The prosecution may contend that there was a trend here rather than a single error. This implies that Jim Jones may be facing a case that has been pending for decades, during which the government has been waiting for the right opportunity to prosecute him. The time has finally arrived. With officials claiming that Jim Jones posed a flight risk, he was now being held without bail. That meant he was going to be in jail until his trial unless something extraordinary happened. In addition, the trial itself is a disaster waiting to happen, because Jim Jones and his attorneys were going to have a life or death battle with this amount of proof. The most significant question was still whether Jim was actually participating or if this was a setup. Within the industry, there were already rumors that Jim Jones was being unfairly singled out. There were many who thought this was just another instance of the government attempting to discredit successful black musicians by citing tenuous links to illegal behavior as a pretext for widespread takedowns. Some thought Jim had been set up, that the person who betrayed him was lying to protect themselves. But then there was a startling new discovery, because based on sources, the FBI wasn't finished yet. Indeed, there were rumors that more arrests were on the horizon. This indicated that the matter was about to get even more complicated. And the second question was, if Jim Jones wasn't working alone, then who else was going to be eliminated? With his hands chained to the table, Jim Jones sat in the chilly, impersonal FBI interrogation room, his thoughts whirling. Only a few hours prior, he had been going about his daily business without realizing that federal officials were getting closer. Now, his horror had imprisoned him. What's the worst part? The FBI wasn't merely pursuing him. Everyone involved was their target, because rumors that were circulated said that Jim wasn't working alone. The majority of fans initially believed that Jim's arrest was just another mistake when it first surfaced on social media, perhaps something little that could be resolved with the help of a skilled attorney and the appropriate contacts. However, as the specifics came to light, it became evident that this was much more significant than anyone had anticipated. This was more than a simple police stop or small legal matter. This was a large-scale federal task. The FBI has been keeping an eye on it for years. In a matter of minutes, news organizations were rushing to get information. Hip Hop DX, The Shade Room, and TMZ all began investigating the case and contacting sources in hopes of learning more. And after that, the internet saw the first significant leak. A senior law enforcement source claimed that Jim Jones had been captured on secret FBI recordings in more than one instance. And these were no informal discussions. The conversations were coded. Conversations indicating Jim was fully aware of what was happening and that he had been part of something much more significant than anyone had thought. The responses came at once. On social media, fans were arguing about whether Jim had actually done what the FBI was alleging. There were those who didn't accept it. Others stated they always had a sneaking suspicion that something was happening behind the scenes. But when insiders began to imply that Jim wasn't the only one engaged, it was the biggest shock. Because rumors have it that the FBI was looking into more than just Jim Jones. They had a whole network under investigation. The subsequent round of arrests then started. Soon after Jim was detained, there were rumors that another prominent person had also been apprehended. No one first knew who. Nothing was being said by the FBI. But the rumors quickly got out. It was a fellow rapper, according to several individuals. It was one of Jim's closest business associates, according to others. What did everyone agree on, though? It wasn't just Jim who was having problems. Another shock came as the rumors began to circulate. Because, according on recently released court documents, this case was about more than just money. It was also about influence, power, and strong industry ties. Private conversations, money trails, and movement tracking had all been conducted by the FBI. Now, they had all the proof they required. This was the worst situation for Jim Jones. Because if one member of this network chose to engage with the federal government, things might quickly get out of hand. That's precisely what transpired next. Sources close to the investigation claim that Jim's acquaintance had already begun speaking. No public announcement of the name was made. But what about behind the scenes? Industry insiders were well aware of who it was. What about Jim? At once he sensed the deception, because the ultimate criminal in the hip-hop scene was snitching. And now he had been betrayed by someone. Jim's legal team was frantically working at the same moment. One of the top solicitors in the industry was already attempting to limit the damage. Jim was innocent, he said in his statement, and this was just another instance of a successful black man being singled out by the system. However, what's the issue? Evidence was mounting. According to reports, the FBI had intercepted text messages, emails, and even video footage in addition to wiretapping calls. These intercepts supposedly connected Jim to high-level meetings with specific people who were the subject of the investigation. And then the greatest shock of all. The federal authorities were not solely examining Jim's recent actions. They were researching his past. Suddenly, things that people had assumed had been long forgotten, old cases, old connections, were back in the news. Once more, the term 9 Trey gangsters began to be used. The issue of whether this had anything to do with the drama from years before began to rise. According to several admirers, Jim had already separated from that life. Others weren't entirely sure. People were conversing on the streets in the meanwhile. Everyone, including former co-workers, industry insiders, and other rappers, had an opinion. Jim's supporters claimed that this was all a part of a bigger plot to overthrow him. Others said Jim had created some enemies over the years and perhaps, just possibly, someone had finally decided to turn him in as a form of retaliation. Then there was another arrest. It was a direct associate of Jim's company this time. The media became enraged. Stories of a hip-hop conspiracy, covert transactions, and a possible RICO case that may bring down Jim and a number of other important figures began to air on news networks. Theories were all over the internet. Did the FBI have any other targets in mind? Could this be the start? Was Jim going to suffer the same fate as previous rappers who found themselves in legal hot water? The situation was made much more dire by the uncertainty. Jim, though, he said nothing. Not a single social media post. No announcements in public. No communication outside of his legal team. He was waiting, sequestered, and locked up. For he still had the most important question: would he fight this? To rescue himself, would he make a deal? One thing was certain, regardless of what transpired next, the worst was far from finished. The harshest reality Jim Jones had ever encountered was inside the chilly walls of the federal detention facility. He had made millions of dollars, developed his career, and established himself as one of the most reputable figures in hip-hop over the years. But now, he was just another prisoner now, waiting to be judged while wearing an orange jumpsuit. On the inside, time had slowed to a crawl, while the outer world was moving quickly. Every second seemed to drag on forever. Fear grew with each minute. He knew the truth in his heart, even though he seemed to be strong and convinced himself that he could win this case. There was no play from the FBI. Something significant was in their possession. It might be the end if he didn't move with caution. Although Jim had previously encountered legal issues, this time was different. It had a sense of closure, a prevailing feeling that there was no way out of the repercussions this time. There were still rumors, ideas, and conjectures circulating in the world outside the prison walls. The media was unrelenting, analyzing every little thing, and the fans. They couldn't decide whether to support him or believe he was guilty. However, the government's next move was when the true horror started. Jim was charged with more crimes by federal prosecutors who cited hidden witness testimony and recently uncovered financial evidence. Officials acknowledged that this case was about more than simply Jim, which made the press conference explosive. They were targeting his whole business. The case was now RICO. A RICO, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations. Charge is one of the most severe legal tools available to the government for those who are not familiar with it. It was created to overthrow drug cartels, mafia lords, and criminal empires, and now, Jim Jones was the target of their use. Industry-wide shockwaves were caused by the news. Everyone was aware of the extremely high conviction rate after being charged with RICO by the federal government. Most people were unable to beat it. Actually, they flipped instead of resisting it. That's just what the FBI was hoping for. Not just Jim was taken into custody. In coordinated raids spanning several states, a number of his longtime colleagues were captured. They were brought in one by one to be questioned. Only one person needed to be broken. The feds didn't need them all to speak. Then it occurred. Somebody broke. After a brief period of silence, rumors quickly spread that one of Jim's closest friends had consented to work for the government. It was a huge betrayal. This was a longtime friend of Jim's who wasn't just some low-level individual attempting to rescue himself. The witness had given important information about coded messages, secret meetings, and money transactions, according to legal insiders. Worse yet, the recordings were in the hands of the federal government. Leaked audio from an undercover informant became viral on the internet. The voices were muted and blurry, but distinct enough to be identified. Jim Jones is said to have been one of them. What about the discussion? It was damning. Jim's conversation on the recording contained very suspect content, including coded language and ambiguous allusions, but it was sufficient for law enforcement. The video went viral, being reposted by all of the major news outlets, analyzed by social media users, and discussed by fans all over the world. One thing was certain, the harm had been done regardless of whether it was a hoax or a misrepresentation. The scenario changed again as the evidence accumulated. The prosecution's target was no longer Jim alone. They were targeting his whole business. There were further subpoenas issued. More were brought in to be questioned. As the pressure increased, cracks began to appear. Those who had vowed allegiance to Jim began to turn away. An old pal declined to comment. Social media users who had previously supported him began unfollowing him. Then the case took a huge turn for the worst. Jim was allegedly connected to offshore accounts, covered investments, and potential money laundering through a sequence of transactions that the FBI had uncovered, a concealed financial trail. This involved more than one transaction, one instance, or one discussion. Up until now, years' worth of transactions had been meticulously concealed. Everything was instantly rejected by Jim's defense team. They said the government was fabricating the situation to make him appear guilty and that it was all a misunderstanding. In private, however, Jim was aware of the reality. He was at a loss for what to do. They were already bracing for the worst. Anything that could spare Jim from being imprisoned for the rest of his life was being considered, including plea agreements and ways to lessen the harm. Jim, though, he was not prepared to concede. Not quite yet, anyhow. Then the last betrayal occurred. A former close acquaintance who Jim had trusted like family consented to testify against him and went on record. Jim was taken by surprise when he heard the news. This wasn't just a stranger seeking a plea bargain. This was an all-knowing person. The announcement caused a stir in the industry. Other rappers left their opinions. Jim's supporters insisted that he was being set up. Others didn't say anything because they knew that if they hung around with him, the feds might find out. The chilliest portion, though, this was not where the government was going. The FBI had a list, officials said, a lengthy list of names. Jim Jones had only just begun. This exceeded all expectations. And what's the scariest? There was much more to this case. Jim Jones was sitting by himself in his cell, his thoughts racing as he stared at the chilly concrete walls. He had been living the life that many could only imagine, traveling freely and making deals just a few weeks prior. He was now imprisoned like an animal in a cage, and the entire federal government was bearing down on him. He had come to terms with the truth of his circumstances. His alleged supporters were disappearing one by one as the evidence against him grew, either by making bargains with the federal government or by simply separating themselves to protect their own reputations. Loyalty talk was common in the rap game, but Jim understood how easily it could vanish when the pressure mounted. Despite his legal team's best efforts to find weaknesses in the government's case, the feds persisted. This case had taken years to develop, and they had no intention of letting him fall between the gaps. Things were getting out of hand now that more proof was emerging. The FBI's release of more surveillance material, clear, high-definition imagery that precludes speculation, was the hardest blow. Jim was seen in the video holding several confidential sessions, whispering and making agreements that were now hard to justify. His attorneys might previously claim that the wiretaps were ambiguous and that the audio might have been altered. But now, this time, it was different. These voices weren't all that. The images were indisputable evidence of his direct participation in operations that he had been denying for months. The internet became viral. Many admirers were now doubting everything they had previously believed about Jim Jones, and social media was ablaze with debates, hypotheses, and reactions. Some continued to defend him, saying that the government had been working against him for years and that it was a setup. However, the growing evidence was too strong for even his most devoted fans to ignore. It was fact now, there in front of their eyes, and no longer merely conjecture. The nightmare went on, even though Jim had assumed he had seen the worst. By making more arrests, the FBI was bringing in other important figures who had been working covertly. Not only were they low-level individuals, but they were also well-known and respected names in the field. The news stories were brutal. Jim Jones wasn't working by himself. Federal sting arrests continue. Dissecting every bit of information and scrutinizing every detail, the media was having a field day portraying Jim as the mastermind of a vast criminal operation. Overnight, the reputation he had spent years cultivating was being destroyed. Now his name was a byword for crime, corruption, and treachery. The mood was changing inside the prison walls. He was beginning to be viewed differently by other prisoners. Respect had first existed because, after all, he was Jim Jones, a rap legend who had established an empire. The respect was now being replaced by distrust as rumors of plea bargains and snitching were circulating. The fact that you were renowned did not alter the unwritten rules of the streets. The danger of Jim's jail life would increase significantly if anyone had any reason to assume that he may become an informant. Every time he passed through the corridors or sat in the cafeteria, he could sense the tension. Everyone was watching him, waiting, and trying to guess what he would do next. His last, best chance to escape spending the rest of his life in prison was presented to him by his legal team in the form of an ultimatum. The plea agreement that the prosecution had offered would drastically cut down on his sentence. However, a catch existed. Cooperation was necessary if Jim desired a chance at freedom. In order to help the feds develop their case against larger targets, he had to testify, give up names, and other things. Flipping on the higher-ups to save yourself was the traditional tactic. However, this was more than just a legal ruling for Jim. It came down to survival, honor, and legacy. Staring at the papers before him, he sat in the little, poorly lighted legal consulting room. It was all explained by his lawyer. With good behavior, he might be out in 10 years or fewer if he accepted the bargain. He would probably end up dead in prison if he refused. His numbers weren't on his side. The conviction rate was startling in federal prosecutions. Once the government has its eyes set on you, they nearly always succeed. Jim had always taken great satisfaction in overcoming adversity and surviving. But this time, it was different. This was no fight with the industry. Neither a label dispute nor a financial loss occurred. Given that this was a federal jail, the government wasn't messing around. He reflected on the people who had relied on him for years, his son and his family. What would happen to them if he was permanently imprisoned? Like so many others who had fallen before him, would they continue to support him or would they go on and forget about him? The streets, the industry, and the unspoken laws that had ruled his life were all on the other side of it. He would have his reputation permanently damaged if he accepted this arrangement and participated. Regardless of the justifications he offered, he would be perceived as a snitch. And in this world, the label not only destroyed careers but also took lives. He reflected on the events of his story and Tekashi 6ix9ine. Tekashi had made a deal, cooperated, and left. However, at what price? He had lost credibility and his reputation was in ruins. He was still creating songs and receiving views, but he would never again be respected. Could Jim tolerate that? Would he be able to exchange his freedom for honor? He felt sick to his stomach at the prospect. The deal's deadline was approaching. He had limited time to make a decision, according to his attorneys. The officials were pressing hard and moving quickly, and if he didn't accept the deal now, it might not be available later. He had to decide. There was a pressure he had never experienced before that night as he lay on his prison cot and stared at the ceiling. Staying ahead of the game and making moves had been his life's work. For the first time, however, he felt really stuck. Whichever choice he took, he was losing something. His legacy and reputation would have been lost if he accepted the arrangement. He forfeited his future and his freedom if he didn't. He was escorted by the guards to another meeting with his legal team the following morning. His mind was still racing as he made his way down the corridor. The fans were anticipating. The industry was holding out. The federal agents were on the lookout. What about Jim Jones? He had to make the most important choice of his life. However, what would he decide on? He used to call them family, but was he going to accept the offer and betray them? Or would he put up a fight until the end, even if it meant receiving a life sentence? There was no doubt that his narrative was far from ended, whatever of his choice. Now, Jim Jones' future is in jeopardy. The FBI's increasing hold, fresh evidence, and the disintegration of his closest group raise the question of whether he will accept the offer or risk all to clear his name. The industry is closely observing, fans are split, and the hip-hop community is rocked. While some contend that Jim Jones would never violate the street rules, others think he has little choice but to turn and cooperate. But let's face it, people in positions of authority have fallen before, and the federal government doesn't lose cases easily. Jim may be facing a more dire outcome than anyone could have predicted if they had additional evidence. What do you anticipate happening next? Is Jim going to accept the offer, or will he refuse to speak up? Leave your comments below with your ideas. Do you think he was actually involved, or is this just another ploy by the government? Because this narrative is far from over, don't forget to like, subscribe, and enable notifications. We'll be providing you with exclusive updates as more information becomes available about Jim Jones' case, the true nature of the FBI's probe, and the potential implications for hip-hop's future. You will want to attend. We'll see you in the next installment, so remain tuned and locked in because this case is going to take an even more bizarre turn.